Sing page 198, Power in the Blood. Page 198, Power in the Blood. 198, power. There is power in the blood. Would you be free from the burden of sin? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Would you or evil a victory win? There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Would you be free from your passion and pride? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Come for a cleansing to Calvary's tide. There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Would you be whiter, much whiter than snow? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Sin stains are lost in its life-giving flow. There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Would you do service for Jesus your King? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Would you live daily his praises to sing? There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. All right, Nick, will you pray for the rest of our service, please?
Father, thank you for this day, and thank you, Lord, for the church that you given us. And Father, we ask you that you bless the rest of the service. And keep your spirit to journey as we give us the message and prepare our hearts so we can receive it.
All right, you can go ahead and be seated. I appreciate you being here this evening. I appreciate everybody who's chose to spend their day off from work and I would say one of your few holidays, but I forgot I'm not in America. You have holidays every other week here. It's no, that's one of the things I've gotten used to now. But one of the first things I notice when I come here, it's like I go to the store and they're all closed. It's a holiday. And then you go again and they're all closed. It's a holiday. And it took me a little while to get used to that because in the U.S., it's like you have a very few holidays where stores close. In fact, there's only really one or two holidays where all the stores are mostly closed, and that's Christmas Day, not even Christmas Eve, but Christmas Day, and then Thanksgiving for half a day. Other than that, pretty much all year round, it doesn't matter. All the stores are open. They have changed since I left because there was one store that was open 24 hours a day, and they said it just got to be where people were stealing too much stuff at night, so they had to start closing the store at night to keep people from coming in and stealing everything because it's a very large store. It's huge. It's like whatever the biggest Carrefour or whatever you've been to here, it's still bigger. It's really a crazy store. It's Lori would go there. The first place I took her in America was there, and she would just go there and spend hours. She wouldn't even buy stuff. It was too much stuff to pick what to buy. It was just to go and look at things. Yes, Walmart. And then EJ knows, but she spent her time there. She's seen it. Stefania, that was one of the first things he wanted to see when he was there. But I'll admit, when I was back, that was usually like if me and Josiah need to go kill time. We'll go stop at Walmart and we'll look and see what cool stuff we find. But I have to say, it really surprised me when I was back there, because used to be if you decide that you want to eat at 3 o'clock in the morning, you'll find somewhere you can go sit down inside and eat at 3 o'clock in the morning. I couldn't find it. I was in a major city and I was trying to find somewhere at 10 o'clock at night, I think, somewhere to sit down inside and eat with my family, and I couldn't find it. And I felt like I wasn't in America anymore. I felt like they had betrayed me or something, because that's the whole benefit of being in America is you can find whatever you want anytime you want. And then I go back and it's gone. So it was a little bit disappointing then. But anyways, I do appreciate you choosing to spend one of your several holidays with us. It's one of the ones where people actually get to be off work. So I do appreciate that. And I know it's also that time of the year where people are on holidays and all those things. People I know have traditions and stuff they probably do. I'm just thinking it's a little bit funny that the Belgians usually struggle to compete in terms of how many people in the service are Belgian versus Romanian or whatever. But due to the fact that you have people out from, Dutch people being out with pregnancies and Romanians all going on holiday and, or I should say birth of babies for the Dutch, and then also for Romanians as well. I think tonight the Belgians actually have probably, are all of you Belgian citizenship normally, or I know you're from here, so you're not just Belgian. You're representing Ghent itself, but I know for you that's the same. I don't know if I remember asking. Are you Belgian citizenship or? Okay, I'm asking because you would think that it'd be something you wouldn't have to ask, but here's the problem. I have found that a lot of Belgian people, even though they were born and raised in Belgium their entire life, if they can find any technicality upon which they can claim to be from another country, they do it. JP, for example, and I'm going to pick on him, and I hope he listens to this. But JP, for example, will tell you that he's Dutch, even though he's never lived in the Netherlands his whole life. He's lived in the Philippines and he's lived in Belgium. He was born and raised here, but there's a technicality that he gets to have a Dutch passport. And Yuri, I think, Mike for sure is with Greece. He claims Greece every time. But that's why I have to ask sometimes, because I just assume, okay, you're from Belgium, you're Belgian. But I found quite a few of them. They find whatever loopholes they can get. But no, I was just thinking about it tonight that normally it's hard for anybody to outnumber the Romanians just because they, by sheer number of children, overwhelm a service. But since most of the ones with children are gone, and I'm not going to let them count mine since they're also half American. No, you can't count. I don't know that you count them at all. Actually, if you ask Josiah says he's Belgian. He says, I've never lived in America, I never lived in Romania, I'm Belgian. So if you ask him, that's what he says, which is fine with me, because I try to get people to realize sometimes that it's probably a bad thing to say on Belgian National Day, but I don't really promote being too loyal to a country. As Christians, my loyalty is to Christ. And while I appreciate my heritage and my country and where I come from, there's a lot to appreciate in those kind of things. It's not where my loyalty lies. I'm not going to be loyal to, I'll be honest, if you look at who the last governor of my state was, you look at my current president, I don't have a lot to be loyal to in terms of where I come from. All right. All that aside, though, I just wanted to point out that the Belgians actually managed on Belgian National Day of all days to take over the service as the most represented people group, I guess. And if not, we're just going to pretend and nobody raise any questions about it. All right. All that aside, I do appreciate you being here. I'm going to try to make the service run a little bit smoother. Lori's going to hate me for what I'm about to say, but we probably won't translate tonight. We'll probably just give a quick study through the message, because I'm going to only do part of what's left of chapter 8. We'll come back and do the rest of it next week. And so I'm going to try to get through it quickly. And if I don't translate, this is one of those messages I can get through quickly. If I translate it, it's going to take all night. So it's not on you. It's just that if I translate it, we got to do a lot of reading. If we don't translate it, I don't have to read a lot. All right, so let's do one more song before we get into that message then. We're going to do page number 38, Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee. The reason why Lori doesn't like it when I say we're not going to translate is because somebody still has to sit back and translate in real time to their mom. And that's a lot harder than when you translate the regular way. So I assume she's going to put Alda to do it. Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee, page number 38. Let's sing together. Joyful, joyful, we adore thee, God of glory, Lord of love. Hearts unfold like flowers before thee, healthy as the sun above. Melt the clouds of sin and sadness, drive the dark of doubt away. Giver of immortal gladness, fill us with the light of day. All thy works with joy surround thee, earth and heaven reflect thy ways. Stars and angels sing around thee, center of unbroken praise. Field and forest, vale and mountain, blossoming meadow, flashing sea, chanting bird and flowing fountain, call us to rejoice in thee. Thou art giving and forgiving, ever blessing, ever blessed, wellspring of the joy of living, ocean depth of happy rest. Thou the Father, Christ our brother, all who live in love are thine. Teach us how to love each other, lift us to the joy divine. Mortals join the mighty chorus, which the morning stars began. Father love is reigning o'er us, brother love binds man to man. Ever singing, march we onward, victors in the midst of strife. Joyful music lifts us onward in the triumph song of life. All right, well, we've got a special guest just arrived. It didn't change what I just said about the Belgians versus the Romanians because it's one of each and then one that's a little bit of both. But we're glad to see Joe and Eliana and even Jonas here with us tonight. All right, we appreciate you coming in. Everybody's going to stop the service to go see the baby. Here, maybe it's better if you just bring me the baby and we can enact the Lion King. I know the words to the song. We can just hold her up in the air and I don't actually know how to pronounce them properly, but I know the words in Swahili. I can just. All right, nobody's going along with that. I realized halfway through singing that song, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but that song is actually German. It's right. It's like the German anthem or something. So it's probably not the best song to have done on Belgian National Day. It could be worse though. There is literally the American national anthem is in this hymnal, so I could have picked a worse song to have done for Belgian Day. All right, I do appreciate them coming in. I have to make a little bit of a joke here. I've been making fun of them that they induced labor, rushed everything, and Rebecca still won. Rebecca had her baby a few hours earlier. Even, no matter how hard they tried to cheat the race, Rebecca still won. But they did win a different race. They got to church first. That's a whole nother race that they managed to win. So anyways, very exciting to have them here this evening. I'm glad to have each of you here. I was trying to say that before I got sidetracked joking about stuff, but I really do appreciate having each of you here. I have not got to spend a lot of time in fellowship with you this evening because last year when we did this, we were late. Like we started the service late and everything because it just took so long to get all the food cooked and get people time to eat it. And it just was too much. This year, Eli got us a bigger grill. And I said, well, I got time, so I didn't rush. I didn't worry about it. And I still barely got it all done in time. In fact, that's about 5 minutes later or so tonight, getting it served. And then afterwards, I made the comment that I would go make s'mores for people who have never had s'mores, but I wouldn't do it for everybody. And then I was a liar because I sat there and made them for everybody. So by the time I actually finished cooking and rushed in here to change and get ready for the service, I think I said hey to Narukashan when I was walking through where the food was, but that's about all the talking I got to do with anybody other than a few people. I just asked them if they had enough to eat, and that was about it. I sat down and talked to Ruben for a little bit, but that's why I was eating my food for just a second. But anyways, I do hope that you've had a good time, a fellowship. I know it's been a little bit long because we had the extra time of fellowship before. We've had the meal. To be honest, the meal, the prayer time, all that's normal for us on a Wednesday night prayer service. The only thing that's really extra tonight is we added 2 hours of fellowship before all of that. And so I'm glad to see the people who came in. I'm glad that nobody killed anybody over a game of Uno. Certain Persian people can be rather competitive about those kind of things. And so I'll say it that way to leave their name out of it. But you can figure out who I'm talking about. But I'm glad that there was a good time of fellowship and everybody hopefully got to enjoy through all of that. All right, let's go to Hebrews chapter number 8. Hebrews chapter number 8. We're not going to finish chapter 8 tonight. We're only going to get a little bit further. Last week we stayed in just one verse. Last week we just talked about what it means to Christ, the new covenant, how significant that is that someone is a mediator, and what that means to us in this covenant as well as we look at the new covenant. Now, tonight we're going to look at the problem with the old covenant, and that'll help us to appreciate a little bit more what all this is about as we actually then get into the new covenant itself next week. And especially what in the new covenant pertains then to Israel, because that's mostly what he's talking about right now. So let's bear that in mind. He's mostly making that contrast between the old covenant and the new covenant and how that pertained to Israel. Now, with that said, Hebrews chapter 8, verse 7 through verse 9, it says, "For if that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. For finding fault with them, he saith, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them out of the hand by the hand. I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, saith the Lord." Now, as we look at this passage, he's getting ready again in the next couple verses to the end of the chapter to start showing why the new covenant is better. Now, if you don't know what the Hebrews is about as a book, to have been part of the studies, to understand some of this, Hebrews is literally the writer who I believe is Paul, and I have good reason we'll get to as we get to the end of the book to say why I believe that. But as we get to this idea, the writer is taking things from the Old Testament, things that the Jewish people would know very well, be very familiar with, Hebrew things. He's taking them and he's laying them out and he's comparing them to Christ. And in making the comparisons, he's showing why Christ is better than all of those things in which they could put their trust. So he is in this chapter and in the chapters before. I mean, he's dealt with Melchizedek in great detail, which, if you don't know, is very important. And we'll talk about it some even on Sunday, why. But he's dealt with Melchizedek in quite a great detail. He has dealt with Moses even. He has dealt with quite a few things. And in fact, actually, the verse we just come from where he's comparing Christ as the mediator versus Moses as the mediator was another time wherein he's comparing the mediators to show that Christ is a greater mediator than Moses. And we can appreciate that. But to fully appreciate that, you actually do have to finish the chapter and understand, well, if they were both mediators, if one mediated the old covenant, one mediated the new covenant, why is Jesus a better mediator? And in this case, it's when you begin to see what was mediated, what was accounted for in the two testaments, is where part of it comes in, or the two covenants, I should say. Now, the thing to note, and I said this last week, I showed it, is when he says covenant, we automatically jump straight back to Abraham. We go back to Abraham and we think he's talking about the covenant that was made with Abraham, wherein God promised to make him the father of a great nation and that his descendants would take that land and they would live there. But he makes it clear in the verses we just read, that's not the covenant that he's talking about. He's talking about something very specific, and that is the covenant that, again, we studied last week to see was mediated by Moses, wherein Moses went on top of the mountain, God gave him the law, he talked with God about his terms and conditions, then he went down off of the mountain and talked with the people of Israel about God's terms and conditions, and then he got the people of Israel to agree to God's terms. Moses was that mediator. Now, we know today, as we talk about the new covenant, there's one mediator between God and man, that's the man Christ Jesus. But on that day, Moses was the one God used to mediate between the people of Israel and God. And so with that, when you look at the covenant he's talking about that. He's talking about when God gave the law to Moses on the mountain, and then Moses took that law down to Israel, and he read it to them and said, this is what God expects of you. And if you do what God expects of you, this is what God promises to do for you. And that was the terms and the conditions. You do this, God will do that. That's the covenant. That's the agreement. Each of them had a side and a purpose in this. And Moses was the one who, again, brought those two groups by the hand together and made that peace, made that covenant between the two of them. That's how God chose to use him. Now, as we get into the covenant and see that's the one he's talking about, it gives us the opportunity then to try to understand and appreciate why that new covenant is going to be better than the old. And again, you won't fully appreciate until we talk about the new. But let's talk about the old first and what was wrong with it. Because he asked a question. If the old covenant was perfect, if there was nothing wrong with the old covenant, why did it need to be replaced? And to you and I, ring as sound. It doesn't hurt as much to hear that as it would to the Jew. Because you never put your faith, or at least most of us have probably never put our faith in the old covenant. Most of us have never looked at any of the covenants to Israel and put our faith in the law or any of that kind of stuff. We've never put our faith in being a Jew. We've not trusted in those kind of things. But to someone who has spent a lifetime being brought up and taught that you're special because you're God's chosen people. You're special because God said you're the apple of his eye. You're special because God said he was going to make you a peculiar people above all the nations of the earth. If you've spent your entire lifetime being raised that way, and then the writer brings your attention and says, if that covenant was perfect, if it was something so worthy of your faith, as most of the Jews had put their faith in it, you see that as Paul discusses in Romans, how that the Jews profited by the fact that God had chose them, but they weren't just inheriting salvation. They had to put their faith in God like anybody else. But many of the Jews, as you see the way they dealt with Christ and what Paul's discussing there in Romans, many of the Jews, in fact, the majority of Jews at that time, had come to a place where they began to trust in the fact that we are the children of Abraham. And you see that especially when you look at the Pharisees. When the Pharisees would be ever questioned by Jesus, whenever they're preached to by Jesus, their reaction many times is, well, we be the children of Abraham. We be the children of Jacob. To point back to their heritage and say that simply because of where I have come from, simply because of my heritage, because of my family, my people, I am closer to God than you by nature. Today, you see this many times in two primary religions that I know of. Jews still do it, but to be honest, I think they're less flamboyant in it than these other two religions, and that's the Catholic Church and the Muslims. Many times people who are raised Catholic and Orthodox as well, I'll throw them with the Catholic in this, are raised with this attitude that, well, we've got it figured out. We're the ones who have the actual traditions. Everybody else is just an offshoot of our religion. And by nature, we're closer to God because, we are the first and everybody splits. They forget to tell you they didn't come around until 400 years after everybody else, after the church had already existed. But that's what happens when they rule a country. Now, I see it more so even with Muslims, though. Whenever you try to give the gospel to somebody who is a Muslim, so many times what you get into is they look at you and they're just completely dumbfounded. They don't understand why you're trying to share with them any religious message because we got it figured out. I mean, we're the ones who had the final prophet. We're the ones who have the truth. Why should I listen to what you have to say? And many times you see that. Well, that's exactly what the Jews were like concerning their heritage as children of Abraham, as the people of Israel. And so when you consider what he's asking from that perspective, you see why this punches a lot harder if you're actually reading it from that point of view. When he asks the question, well, if your covenant that you've trusted in your entire lifetime, That promise that God said, I'll make you a peculiar people above all nations of the earth. You'll be my peculiar people, and I'll put you above all nations. If that's what you've trusted your entire lifetime, and then Paul speaks up and says, if that was perfect, why did you need a new covenant? Because you understand, the new covenant is not something that was introduced in the New Testament. The new covenant is not something that just come up and Jesus said, I'm going to create a new covenant. The new covenant is something talked about in the Old Testament. You find many, in fact, most of what you find about it is in Jeremiah. It's something that God had prophesied many times to them. And so whether they agreed with Christianity, whether they believed Jesus was the Son of God, none of that was relevant to this question. That's why it's such a beautiful question when he's asking them, if your covenant that you put your trust in is so good, why did God need to make another one? Is because the question is still relevant. The question doesn't change regardless of whether they believe anything else he said up to this point. Whether they believe anything he showed them about Jesus, about Jesus' relationship to the law as a priest of Melchizedek, or any of that kind of stuff that he's talked about, they don't have to believe any of it for that question to hit home. Because that question doesn't come from the New Testament. That question doesn't come from the teachings of Jesus. That question comes from the Old Testament, which they profess to believe. So he's taking their faith and he's holding it up to them and saying, according to your faith, the covenant that you've walked around here saying we don't need Jesus because we're the children of Abraham, God said he was going to replace it. So if it's so good and so perfect, why did God say he was going to replace it? That's a powerful question when you realize what he's asking them. And so then he goes on to explain to them in these verses we just read that the problem was not actually the covenant, it was them. Now the question is great because it takes away that defense, but then the answer is even more hard-hitting because the answer is, well, actually the covenant wasn't the problem. The problem was the people of Israel. The problem were the people who were trusting that covenant instead of doing their part of the covenant. The people who were trusting, well, if I'm just born a child of Abraham, then God has to bless me. He doesn't have a choice. Instead of realizing that you made a deal with God and you've not kept your part of the deal from the very beginning. And that's what I want to look at tonight as we try to understand this passage a little bit more. But let's read the verses again now that I've explained some of it and try to help you to see what I've been saying. He says in verse 7, for if the first covenant had been faultless, if it's perfect, if there's nothing wrong with it, then should no place have been sought for the second. So he says Jeremiah would have never said there's going to be a new covenant if the old covenant was good enough. If it was perfect and there was nothing needed, then Jeremiah would have no prophecies about a new covenant. Then he says in verse 8, for finding fault with them, he saith, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. So he's pulling from those Old Testament prophecies about the new covenant. And he's saying God saw that the covenant wasn't perfect. And that's why God prophesied way before any of this. Because even when you look at Israel's side of the new covenant, that's prophecy stuff. That's not even stuff that's happened now, what he talks about in the new covenant for Israel. That's stuff that'll happen in the tribulation and into the 1,000-year reign of Christ. So it's not stuff that we can say now has happened. So understand this. When he's saying that God looked down the road and said that covenant wasn't good enough, I'm going to do a better one, he wasn't saying that even necessarily. Jesus coming is part of it. Don't take me wrong with what I'm about to say, but he wasn't referring to the first coming of Christ when he said that. He was referring to the second coming of Christ. He was saying in the second coming of Christ, we're going to fix the problems. That's when all this stuff's really going to get resolved. Concerning Israel and their part of this new covenant. Now, that's what verse 9 is pointing us to. Verse 8 is pointing us to. Verse 9 then shows us what the problem is. Verse 9 says, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them out by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, saith the Lord. So that verse defines which covenant he's referring to. As we've already said, it's the one that was made there at Mount Sinai as they're bringing the laws down and people are confirming and saying, we promise to do all of this. That verse also defines for you what is the problem with the covenant. Why did God need to make the new covenant? It's because the people were never going to keep the old covenant. The people of Israel were never going to do what they were supposed to do. And that's goes to the heart of what the law is. The law was a schoolmaster to lead men to repentance. The law is not wrong. The law is not bad. The law is not evil. We just can't keep it because we're sinners by nature. And in Israel's case, they didn't even really try to keep it. From the very beginning, they were breaking the covenant. That's why I say if we translate this, I have to read more. By not translating, I think I can read a little bit less, but we still have to read some. So let's jump back to Exodus 24. I think we read a little bit of this last week anyways, but we'll read it again. This is the covenant being confirmed. Exodus 24 and verse number 3. I'm sorry, got Ezekiel, not Exodus. Exodus 24 and verse number 3. It says, and Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments, and all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord hath said we will do. And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord, and rose up early in the morning, and builded an altar under the hill, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the children of Israel, which offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen unto the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. And he took the book of the covenant and read in the audience of the people. And they said, all that the Lord hath said we will do, and be obedient. And Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people, and said, behold, the blood of the covenant which the Lord hath made with you concerning all these words. This is the covenant he's talking about. This is Moses coming as a mediator between the two of them and sprinkling the blood, because that's part of the mediator's job. Again, we see Jesus doing that with the new covenant. But Moses coming in as that mediator and taking both groups and saying, okay, I've spent some time on top of the mountain with God. He's given his list of rules. This is his terms and conditions. Do you agree? And then, of course, they say, we agree. So are you sure you agree? Yes, we agree. So then they confirm the covenant, and he sprinkles them with blood to seal the covenant. Now, what you have to understand is that's not something that just happened in a chapter. Now, we just read it in a few verses. But what all plays into that goes back, I guess, at least as far back as chapter 19. It's the first time this covenant is mentioned. It's chapter 19. From chapter 19 till now, God has been telling Moses, if we're going to do this, Israel has to do this, 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 this. And we think of, when we hear the covenant, 10 commandments. But you know the 10 commandments don't occupy from chapter 19 to chapter 24. The 10 commandments don't even take up a whole chapter. So there's a lot more laws that they're agreeing to than just the 10 commandments. But if you were to just take the 10 commandments, you realize that they break these immediately. The first commandments, to have no other gods before him, and to make no golden, no molten images, no idols, none of that stuff of anything in heaven and so forth. Those first two commandments, what is the first thing they do when Moses goes back up on the mountain with God as part of all of this getting things ready? They go and make a golden calf and say, look, the God that has delivered us from the land of Egypt, and start worshiping it. So they make a promise to God that, if you'll make us a great nation above, and we'll look at God's side of this in a moment, what he promises. But they make a promise to God and say, if you'll make us a great nation above all others, and we'll be your peculiar people, and the God of heaven and earth will put his attention on us and work specifically and specially through us. Oh, sure, we'll do it. We'll do whatever you ask. And then literally the first 10 basic commandments. Again, you have much more than that. You have chapters and chapters of other commandments after that. But just those first 10 basic commandments, which are the foundation to help establish the rest of these commandments, they can't even keep those. I mean, they can't even wait until the dust has settled from saying, we'll do whatever you ask, and actually keep those. And so you think across your Old Testament that they ever tried to actually keep them? You may have a king that rises up from time to time who tries to keep them. But in general, the people of Israel as a whole, as a nation, never tried. Their leadership was corrupt most of the time and never let them try. I mean, Aaron immediately is the one who takes them into this worshiping of the golden calf. And as you follow it beyond that, whenever there's not a good man in charge, like a Moses, like a Joshua, almost immediately as a nation, they're running after these things. They're like children who have to constantly be led by the hand, or else they will not keep the covenant for more than 5 minutes. I mean, that's about the extent when you look at it. Now, if you consider some of the rules and things they're agreeing to, and we won't read because we would have to read literally chapter 20, 21, 22, and 23 to read what I want to say. But if you were to look at the rules, so you have the 10 commandments in chapter 20. So you have those commandments, of course, we know is to have no other gods before him, so you know, fake gods, to not make idols, graven images, and so forth, to worship, to not take God's name in vain, which you could argue that they've done in that as well when they say this is the God that brought us out of the land of Egypt, but that's a little more debatable. Um, the next one would be to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. Then you have, honor your mother and father. You have to not kill, to not steal, to not bear a false witness, to not covet. And maybe because I rattled those off fast and wasn't counting, as I say, I might have skipped over one. But, they're fairly straightforward commandments. And for the most part, most people define it and say this, that the first 5 deal with one thing, the first 5 with another. I honestly feel like it's more like this, that 4 of them are uniquely about your relationship to God. 4 of them are uniquely about your relationship to men, and 2 of them pertain to both. And that is to honor your mother and father, because that is something that teaches us how to honor God and all other authorities. It is something that points us to God in the first place, and if we fail in that, we'll fail in our relationship to God. Then the other one being to not covet, because when we covet, covetousness becomes idolatry according to Colossians. So when we covet, what we do is we look at something or someone or whatever it is, and we begin to say, if I just had that, I would be happy. And because we begin to say, if I just had that, I would be happy, that thing becomes an idol to us. So you don't have to agree with my breakdown of them. You can go with the normal 5 and 5, and you're welcome to that. But at the end of the day, what you have is a basic guideline. Jesus does something similar in the New Testament, where he says all the law and prophets can be brought into these 2 nails and hung on them, which is to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, soul, strength, and to love thy neighbor as thyself. So, the same way that Jesus does that, that's what God's doing in the 10 Commandments. He's saying, if you could follow these 10 and actually truly follow them, I don't have to give you the rest of the law because you would do it by nature. But since you're not, here's some more laws. And then he goes in and he begins to explain the first set of laws are about how they worship God and how they serve him. The next set of laws are about the value of life. That's where you get the ones about the value of the life of a slave, a baby in the womb, the life of an animal. The next set of laws are about restitution, about how if I steal from somebody, I have to pay them back. If I destroy your property, I have to pay you back, and so forth. It's about being decent one toward another. And in fact, to be honest, you could say the rest of the law up until we get back to the laws about God are about human decency, because even the ones beyond that are about how I treat you as a person. Some call them social justice laws, but it's really about how I treat you as a person. And if somebody does this, this is what happens to them. So it's a list of laws that in reality, God's not asking a tremendous amount in any of those laws. I mean, if you think the 10 Commandments are pretty much a summary of those laws, and the laws themselves are a way of expounding and explaining further the technicalities in case somebody's trying to weasel their way around having to actually keep the commandment by the spirit of what it means. But if you just took the 10 Commandments, is it too much to ask that we don't worship false gods and idols? No. Is it too much to ask that we don't make idols? No. Is it too much to ask that we don't misuse God's name and take his name in vain? No. Was it too much to ask them, the Jews, to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy? To give one day a week where it's God's when it's part of your agreement? No, I don't think it's too much regardless, but especially when you consider that it's part of the terms and agreements that God says, I will bless you more than you could ever get by on your own if you give me one day a week. And so if you look at it in those terms, it's definitely not too much to ask. And it's certainly, anybody ought to be able to sit down for a day and not do much. We ought to be able to take a day off. That's not a hard ask. And yet for them, their trust in their money and their work and their care about their life was too much many times. And especially when you get beyond just the Sabbath day into the Sabbath years and high Sabbaths and all that kind of stuff, because it gets pretty crazy at times when you're trying to keep up with all of it. Now, none of that's too much to ask. You get into the second half. I don't think anybody in this room is going to say it's hard to not commit murder. None of you have done it, so as far as I know, none of you have done it. So I don't think anybody's going to say it's too hard. I can't handle that. It's just God's asking too much of me when he says I shouldn't commit murder. Lying is a little bit harder, but that's why it's interesting. He doesn't say thou shalt not lie in this commandment. Now, lying is a sin throughout the Bible, so don't take this as a justification for lying. But the commandment in the 10 Commandments is not to bear false witness against somebody. So it's not a little white lie. It's me going and saying, Narukashan this, or Reuben did this, or bringing you and getting you in trouble by the lying of my words. It's much heavier and more severe. So it's still a very reasonable thing to have asked of anybody. Covetousness, in all honesty, is not a hard thing that God's asked. It's just keeping a perspective so that we don't love people and things and stuff so much that they become more important to us than God. Adultery, that's the one I think I missed earlier. Adultery is something that shouldn't be hard to ask. It should be a perfectly reasonable thing. Anybody who got married made a commitment, and it should be perfectly reasonably asked. Stealing, it should be perfectly reasonable. It should be the strangest thing in the world that somebody would steal something from somebody else. I mean, so if you think about it, everything God's asked is within reason, but yet they never do it. None of those commandments did they ever keep for any length of time as a nation. Now, again, you'll find people who love God. You'll find individuals who love God and did their best to serve Him. But as a nation who made a promise to God and said, as a nation we'll serve God, they never really tried. And so as you go through those laws that go throughout those chapters, that they heard it all, they listened to it. And just like you read the terms and conditions before you agree to them, when you click I agree on a website, that's exactly what they did. Moses talked, but they didn't listen to a word of it probably. Moses talked, but they never thought about it. They never cared. They weren't interested. Or to be honest, it could be worse than what I'm saying. Because the alternative is that they listened. They just didn't believe God would actually do anything. They believed that God would maybe promise to help them, but they weren't afraid of His judgment or His wrath if they didn't keep their end. So when you understand it in those terms, the problem of the covenant wasn't that the law was unreasonable or that God was asking too much if they wanted to be blessed. Because let me make this clear too. This is not about salvation, what you're reading when you're talking about this covenant. This is about God's blessing them as a nation and using them as a nation. Nobody gets saved as a nation. I can't choose tonight for the entire country of Belgium for them to put their faith in Christ and go to heaven. Each person individually has to make a choice. Nobody can make a covenant on behalf of a nation to be saved. So it has nothing to do with salvation. This is people making a covenant that we as a nation, the same way you as a family can say, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. The same way that we as a church can say our church is going to stand on the word of God. They as a nation said, if God's going to bless us, we will keep His commandments. But then they never actually even gave any heart or concern to them whatsoever. And they immediately failed in them. And the problem wasn't that God was asking too much. It's that they never tried. Now, let's go back and see what God said to them. That'll be what I probably will try to close on, is we go back and see what God said to them, some of the things He promised. So I'll read one in Exodus 19. Exodus 19 and verse number 3. And Moses went up unto God, and the Lord called unto him out of the mountain, saying, Thus shalt thou say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, Ye have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto myself. Now therefore, if ye will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. So he's saying you'll be uniquely mine above everybody else. Even though the whole world belongs to me, you will be special above everybody else as my possession. And ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. And Moses came and called for the elders of the people, and laid before their faces all the words which the Lord commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, All that the Lord hath spoken we will do. And Moses returned the words of the people unto the Lord. So you see, this is a process going on across several chapters, this back and forth between God and the people, of them saying, yeah, sure, we accept all the terms and agreements, that's fine. All the cookies, whatever we accept, just let me read my site. The way you do that, that's what they're doing. That's why I'm taking something so mundane wherein you don't consider what you're consenting to. You just click it without reading. That's what they're doing. They're listening, but they're not listening. They're agreeing, but they're not actually agreeing in their hearts. It doesn't matter to them. Only thing they're hearing is if you'll say yes, God's going to bless you above all nations so that you're His special treasure in all the earth, the apple of His eye. If you'll just say yes, God is going to make you a nation of kings and priests so that everybody in your country is like a king and everybody in your country is a priest to bear God's light out into the world. And if it sounds familiar, God says something similar to the church in the New Testament. The difference is it's without the condition. It's if you've put your faith in Christ, you are this. With Israel, it was conditional. It's if you really are sure that you're going to keep my covenant, you're going to do what I said and agree to this, then this is what I'll do for you. As a nation, this is what I'll do. They say yes, but it's because they think if they say yes, God will give them what they want, but they don't realize that God is expecting them to keep their end of the bargain, that there is something that they have to do. And I guess the other part of where this covenant goes, we'll read a few more verses in Exodus 23 again, or back towards Exodus 23 and verse number 20. I don't know if I'll read this whole portion here. This is a long portion I have written down to read, but we'll read part of it at least. Exodus 23 and verse 20. Behold, I send an angel before thee to keep thee in the way and to bring thee into the place which I have prepared. Beware of him and obey his voice. Provoke him not, for he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him. But if thou shalt indeed obey his voice and do all that I speak, then I will be an enemy unto thine enemies, and an adversary unto thine adversaries. For mine angel shall go before thee, and bring thee in unto the Amorites, and the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and the Canaanites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I will cut them off. Thou shalt not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do after their works, but thou shalt utterly overthrow them and quite break down their images. And ye shall serve the Lord your God, and he shall bless thy bread and thy water, and I will take sickness away from the midst of thee. There shall nothing cast their young, nor be barren in thy land. The number of thy days I will fulfill. I will send my fear before thee, and I will destroy all the people to whom thou shalt come, and I will make all thine enemies turn their backs unto thee. And I will send hornets before thee, which shall drive out the Hivite, the Canaanite, the Hittite from before thee. I will not drive them out from before thee in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the beasts of the field multiply against thee. By little and little I will drive them out from before thee, until thou be increased and inherit the land. And I will set thy bounds from the Red Sea even unto the sea of the Philistines, and from the desert unto the river. For I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and thou shalt drive them out before thee. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor with their gods. They shall not dwell in thy land, lest they make thee sin against me. For if thou serve their gods, I will surely be a snare unto thee. That's part of the covenant. Because chapter 24 is where they say, yeah, we hear it all and we agree. That's in the terms and conditions. The terms and conditions are this. If you'll trust me, I will take you to Canaan land. So you got all the laws, but at the end of it, you have this. If you trust me, I will take you to Canaan land, and I will send my angel before you, and I will drive out every enemy you have so that you don't even have to fight them. Now, I'm not going to do it all at one time because you're not big enough to possess the land right now, and if I do it all at once, the land's going to overgrow. But city by city, I'm going to give it to you. Area by area, I'm going to give it to you if you'll just trust me and serve me. And you think about some of the stuff he says there. Like he says, I'm going to drive out sickness from you so that nobody in your country is going to get sick. Nobody's going to be barren anymore. And it's some pretty hefty promises he's making them if you follow the terms and conditions. And if you will do this, this is what I'll do for you. But you have to promise your covenant is with only me. You're not going to make a covenant with them or their gods. What's the first thing they do? First thing they do is they don't follow God into Canaan land when they get there. They made the promises. They agreed to the terms and conditions. And then when they get the chance to go in Canaan land, they say no because the giants are too scary. Then when the next generation comes, the ones who actually didn't agree to all of this but have inherited the covenant, they at least have the decency to follow God into Canaan land. However, what's one of the first things they do under the leadership of Joshua? Well, they make a covenant with the people there from Gibeah, the Gibeonites. They make a covenant with them when God said you're not to make a covenant with anybody from that land, that you're not to leave any of them, you're to drive them all out, or God, will become a snare unto you. So the agreement was, if you listen to me, you cannot begin to imagine what God's talking about when he's talking about blessing them. Can you imagine having God's blessing on a country so much that nobody's barren, the sickness is gone, enemies are driven out, nobody's going to be able to mess with you. God's going to take care of you in a way where when all the world sees you, because remember, what does God actually ask of Israel? To declare my glory unto all nations. If they had actually followed him, they would have been like a lighthouse shining light across the entire world where people are looking and saying, if that's what God does for those people, I want to know their God. But they didn't listen to him. And he said, what happens if you don't listen to me? Then I become the trap for you. I become the snare. I become the problem. Actually, if you think about it, it makes perfect sense what he's saying. The deal is, if you listen to me, and we go in this and we keep our agreements, then I will bless you beyond any measure. But if you don't keep the agreements, then the consequences are going to be greater than you ever want. That's what God's asking them to agree to. And again, over and over, the agreements have been read. The leadership agreed to it. Moses brought them into agreement. The people agreed to it. Everything has went through. And when it's signed, They say, okay, God, make us a people greater than the others while we go worship this golden calf over here. Make us a people greater than the others while we go over here and make a covenant with these people who you told us not to make covenants with. Make us greater than the others while we go marry the daughters of these other lands and we begin to worship their gods and turn our hearts away from you. Make us a people greater than the others while we go over here and commit murder and all these other evil things that we said we would never do. Make us greater than the rest while we live worse than the rest. Or we live like the rest. Whatever, it doesn't matter. But the deal was you have to do better if you want better. And they refused to do it. So the problem with the covenant is why it had to be replaced, because it's a great question, but the answer is actually even more severe. The problem with the covenant wasn't that God asked too much of them, and it wasn't that God wasn't willing to do it. God was completely willing to do what he promised. What he asked was within reason, and it was attainable. It's not like salvation wherein you could never be good enough. In this case, what he asked was an attainable goal for them as a country to have at least met this enough that God would have put up with them. Because we know, looking at God, that if there was one person who failed, it probably wouldn't have been a Achan situation. We see many times people in Israel fail, and God doesn't destroy the whole nation because of one person. He deals with that one person, and the nation gets back on track. But at the end of the day, all that speculation aside, I look at this, and God gave them a reasonable goal. He gave them a great blessing if they followed. The problem wasn't anything to do with the covenant itself. It was with the people who agreed to it. That they never kept their end of the bargain, and so therefore God could never be to them what he promised he would be to them. God could never use them and bless them the way he wanted to because they refused to do their part. Now, saying that, next week we'll get into the new covenant and what it has and see some of the great blessings of that and why that new covenant does show that Christ is better as the mediator of it. Father, we thank you and praise you, God, for what you do. We pray that you watch over us, help us to serve you. I pray that you take these thoughts today and use them, Lord, to stir in everybody's heart. I pray, God, if somebody's here that's listening through some means, that God, that they put their confidence in religion, traditions, or something other than you, that God, you'd waken their hearts and help them to see that those things will never make them good enough, that those things are insufficient, and that God, we would put our trust in you and serve you today. I pray, God, you'd help us, Lord, to look at our lives and see how you've blessed us, and that, Lord, while these things may not be required, our service may not be required for salvation. It's certainly not. That God, if there's places where we're failing you in our service, that you'd help us, Lord, to pick up our end of these things and start doing what you would want us to do and be what you'd have us to be. Father, we thank you for what you do, and we ask it in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen. All right, I appreciate you being here this evening. Again, I hope the time, the fellowship, everything's been a help to you. You see why I didn't translate. We got out at the later time of what I try to be out by without translation tonight. And that means I cut half of my time off already. So anyways, I do hope that it's a help to you and encouragement what we've talked about tonight. I hope the time and fellowship is as well. You can take